Today, on Energy Contact, the mind and the body are the same thing. It's just two ways of perceiving this single, whole, individual organism that we call the self. We know it now, but that's not what we were taught in school. We were taught just the opposite. And in fact, kids today are being taught just the opposite. Well, what's up with that? We're about to see that our model of brain, body, mind, spirit, and soul was shaped by politics and marketing 500 years ago, just like it is today. Want to find out more? Well, it's coming up right now on Energy Contact. Hello, and welcome to Energy Contact. My name is Joseph Willenbrink. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to the production staff here in the studio for helping me get my message out to you. Energy Contact is a series I'm presenting as a public service. It's about attaining perfect health, growth, self-improvement, happiness, and realizing your full potential. We're talking about things that have to do with making an energetic contact with yourself internally and with the world around you. There's no difference between the body, the mind, the spirit, the emotion, the intellect, the ego. There's no difference between mass and energy. We spend a lot of time trying to separate things out, to isolate and categorize. But in fact, all that health and growth and self-improvement take place at the point where we put those things together, where we make energetic contact between that unseen world and our physical self. So we're presenting a new way of seeing ourselves and a new way of seeing the world around us. We're presenting a brand new model, a brand new paradigm, a new paradigm that's thousands of years old. We're presenting extraordinary topics for ordinary people. Let's move right ahead with that, and let's bring up our first slide. Everyone, please know that I am not a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. This show is in no way a medical show. If you're looking for medical advice, please go somewhere else. I might call myself an energy healer or a chakra healer. So might you, so might a lot of folks. But state, federal, and local governments absolutely do not. There's important information on this slide here. We're going to leave it up for a few seconds. I'll ask you to please read it with all awareness. And when you kind of got it down, if you would, please go locate a pencil and paper. Here's why. At the end of this show, we're going to run some credits, and on those credits is going to be contact information for me. I invite and encourage you to contact me. But in order to do that, you're going to need to get that contact information. And in order to get that, you're going to need a pencil and paper. Now, there'll be plenty of time to read that stuff and jot it down. There just won't be enough time to start searching for all that. So if you'd go get it now, that would be great. All right, let's come back up here. Today's show is show number 37. If you're joining me for the first time today, thank you. Thank you so much and welcome. I think you'll enjoy the show. These shows, we are talking about things on today's show, things that we brought up in earlier shows, we explained on previous shows. So there's some ramp-up time, some up-to-speed time that you will have missed out on. But I'm doing my very best to make each show have value complete on a standalone basis. And I think that you will enjoy the information on this show. If it is your first time, and if what you see piques your interest, then I'll invite you to look for earlier shows. They'll be coming back on later, either here on this channel or perhaps in the different cable areas where your friends live. If you look for them, I'll appreciate it. All right, and now it's the fun part of our show because now I get to introduce the brains of this outfit. We're going to bring Slim on. Slim, his tie is a little crooked here. Slim is my co-host on the show, and he's helping us understand the physical self. Since we're investigating what energy contacts in the physical self, we have to understand a couple of things, huh? We need to know energy, and this show is certainly about energy. But energy out there somewhere does us no good if we don't understand that thing that the energy contacts. Slim is here to help us with that. Remember, a body without energy is just a corpse. And energy without a body might be a number of cool things, but it's not a human. All right, previously on Energy Contact, we have been we've been talking about the body intellect and the anatomy that it builds. We've seen how the same materials in our brains that give us thought, reason, memory, recall, logic, all those things we think of as brain things, how in fact they're not brain things at all. These things go on in every cell of our body. We've seen how thought creates anatomy, how that body intellect builds us. We've been looking here on recent shows about our brain. We found out there's a couple of them, our nervous system and our mind. And with respect to that mind, we've seen that the mind is a much different entity than what we always thought it was. That the mind is something that indeed pervades every cell of our body. So the body is our mind. And our subconscious mind then, we've seen, is a bunch of neuropeptide molecules. And they go around and connect with the appropriate sensing molecules all over our body. We've spoken as well a little bit about that old mysterious energy that Indian mystics called Kundalini. Well, today we want to continue to understand our mind more fully. We've seen that the mind is a part of the body, much different than the brain, when all we've ever learned in school is that the mind is a part of the brain, much different than the body. Well, we want to resolve that today. Today we're going to look at models and philosophies upon which our medical science and science in general is based. What's right and wrong with these models, and why we have so much trouble letting go of old things and moving on. I've been saying that the present paradigm is obsolete. I say at the beginning of every show. But if so, how have science and medicine made so many positive strides using this model that I'm calling a flawed one? Remember, before this so-called flawed model came into existence, our life expectancy was maybe 40 years old. Now, with its help, we have learned to expect our life to go well into the 80s and beyond. So, the contemporary model's doing something right, but it's failing to explain some newly discovered facts, huh? The ligands and receptors that we've been talking about, second brains and parallel nervous system, the fact that a billion different people made of the exact same atomic structure build themselves in a billion different ways, the internal forces that animate us, the external forces that pull and push us around, or the reasons for how we act the way we act, think the way we think, and feel the way we feel. So today, we're going to look at more history than anatomy. And eventually, all this will lead us back to that Kundalini energy that we've been alluding to. All right, much to do today, but first, everybody take a moment and take a breath, because now is the part of our show where we take our virtual field trip, our journey, if you will, in our mind's eye. Today, we're going to take a little walk out into nature, to a huge pond where a bunch of frogs are. And when we find this pond, we'll find something else on the pond. There's just tons of lily pads. And so there they are, and we're looking, and our attention is drawn to one frog in particular. No special reason, really. He just catches our eye. And so we watch him, and as we look at him, he takes off from the shore in this big kind of gracious leap, and he's floating in the air. And he goes to land on one of these lily pads out in the lake. But then something weird happens. The lily pad sort of spits him back out somehow. It rejects him. It makes him unwelcome. And so he hops over to another lily pad, and it does the exact same thing. So now this poor frog's in the water swimming around from lily pad to lily pad and being rejected by a lot of them, until finally he swims up to one, and an opposite phenomenon occurs. It seems to accommodate him. It almost kind of puts a leaf down to help him get out of the water. It welcomes him, and when he gets on board, when he gets on the spot, it kind of wraps him in a blanket a little bit. It's glad to see him. It's glad to have him. And then all of a sudden, we notice something else happens. Somehow, the energy, the mood, the feeling of the whole pond changes somehow. Fascinating. So about that time, we look around and we notice something else. We were so focused on that frog that now all of a sudden we look around and there are billions and billions and billions of frogs. And they're all jumping around to billions and billions and billions of lily pads, and they're all getting rejected from pad to pad, but every time one of them finds the spot that welcomes them, the mood of that whole pond changes again. And even the mood of the air around the pond. All right, hold that thought. We know now that most of what's going on in the nervous system is not that old touch a thorn and recoil system that we've always learned about at all. There's more going on than that. Emotional and spiritual events in us fix themselves to something physical. That is, unseen things, moods, emotions, beliefs, do not occur until and unless they attach as a physical thing to a physical thing. There are things in us called ligands and receptors which interact, and those ligand-receptor interactions change us. They change the way we look, we act, we feel, we think. Well, the ligands are sort of like the frogs in our story, and the receptors are like those lily pads. And really, the model is a good model for explaining how those things go on in us if we can imagine billions enough of frogs and billions enough of lily pads. All this sort of stuff is going on in you and I at the rate of millions of reactions per second right now all over our bodies. All right, so the stimuli, in scientific terms, the stimuli associated with certain states of mind are called neuropeptides or ligands. While technically those two terms are not the same, we're using them interchangeably on Energy Contact, and we'll get away with it. Neuropeptides, then, these ligands, they bind and they transfer specific instructions by binding to the receptor and then transmitting that information into the receptor, which in turn transmits it into us. The neuropeptide endorphin, for example, is designed to transmit signals of well-being through us. What makes this information so important is that it has led to discovering the physiological basis of our emotional self, of our spiritual self. That means the sameness of body, mind, spirit, emotion, intellect, so on and so forth. That's a very big deal because it flies in the face of much of what science has stood for almost 500 years now. Scientists do not use words like soul and spirit. It scares them to death. It's not scientific, or so they think. We're learning differently. We know now that every cell in our body has intelligence and that our body is our mind. These neuropeptides then, well, they're our subconscious mind. And while this explains how some of the molecules of spirit and feeling work, we're not really interested in that today. We're sort of glossing over that. The reason this information has value to us today is we want to look at the information that makes it so hard for us to switch our models, to switch our way of thinking. On previous shows, every time we looked at this ligand receptor stuff, the gut brain, the parallel nervous system, all that, I've remarked that science didn't even know about these things until the 1970s, and they didn't. We are looking at all of this stuff as an example of how new discoveries make old models show themselves to be obsolete. We're investigating about something in the way we think that makes it difficult for us to see what's right in front of our face. These recent findings have shown us the need for a new model. It's a transition point in the history of science. It's an epochal time. At the beginning of every show, I tell you we're presenting a brand new paradigm that's thousands of years old. We're going to understand that a little bit more today. Science problems are solved and experiments are conducted by building models. We're going to talk about scientific models. So the way the thing goes is you solve the problem in the model, and then you roll it out to the big world. Let's bring up a slide. I'm going to show you something that every science student learns in school. All models are wrong, and some models are useful. Every math and science student learns this. So scientific models and mathematical models and medical science models are not supposed to be photorealistic. They just provide us a pedagogy, a structure in which to work. Just like my frogs and lily pad story. You've got no frogs and lily pads inside your body. It just explains something. Well, that's the way things work in the lab. As long as the model works for us, we keep using it. All right, so let's come back up here. The thing is that the model that we've been using for nearly the past 500 years that has served us very well is wrong. Like every other model. No surprise there, nothing wrong about that. The fact that it's wrong doesn't surprise us. It's supposed to be wrong. But we're learning that it's no longer relevant, and that in the light of new knowledge, we're getting to the point where it might even be perhaps harmful. So somebody must have a lot of energy invested in hanging on to that status quo, huh? Even though we know it's wrong. Why? Well, we want to look at the history of all that. And to do that, we're going to go back to the time of a fellow named René Descartes. Once upon a time, this fellow Descartes existed. He was a great scientist and a great thinker. Let's bring up another slide. This slide says, cogito ergo sum. On the very bottom, you see below in French the way he would have said it, and in the bottom the way we say it. I think, therefore I am. Very profound statement. Everybody's heard it before. Matter of fact, it's more profound perhaps than it is useful. Descartes said that. Remember when you studied math in school, you studied the Cartesian coordinate system, the XY plane and all that? That's analytic geometry. Well, it's really the Descartesian coordinate system. Descartes invented all that. He did a bunch of great stuff. But this great mind is also responsible for being the father of much of our misconceptions. Let's come back up here. Descartes fathered the dualist reductionist methodology in science and medicine that we still use and misuse today. And we're about to learn the how and why of that. Back in that day, by the way, was Descartes was born just before 1600. Descartes was a good Catholic in a time when the Catholic Church ruled everything. So before we continue with Descartes, let's take a moment and go back and we'll look at the Church and the times in which it lived. Long prior to Descartes' time, in fact, the Church considered the mind to be the same as the soul, just as we're saying now on Energy Contact. And they considered it all to be an integral part of the body as a whole. The heart resided, or the mind resided, in different spots of our body. The most popular one being the heart, like the Bible says. Mind and body were considered one, so bodies were as sacred as souls. This meant that it was sacrilegious to do things like cut open or take apart a cadaver, for instance. Well, in the mid-1500s, science actually started doing something, that was a little different. It started being scientific. It left the realm of the wizards with the pointy hats and the flashing powders and stuff, and it started finding scientific revelations, and that alarmed the Church. This was the day of Copernicus, who had the nerve to contend that the sun and the planets did not revolve around the earth. Galileo, who agreed with that, came along just after. And Galileo, who was 32 years older, than Descartes, was condemned by the Roman Inquisition. Descartes did not want to suffer that fate himself. Furthermore, while Descartes was not a medical researcher per se, that's not what he's gone down in history for, he wanted access to cadavers for the purpose of dissection. All right, so Descartes struck a deal with the Pope at that time. It was Pope Urban VIII for you trivia buffs. Also for you trivia buffs, that he was indeed the Pope that authorized Galileo's condemnation. All right, Descartes and Pope Urban made a pact though, a compromise if you will. They agreed to accept that the soul resides in the mind and that human disease resides in the body. Not based on any fact, they just agreed to it. Descartes now had the blessing of the church to be scientific. The first scientist in history probably to ever have that sanction. And because of this, he had plenty to lose if he started going around and discovering things that rubbed people the wrong way. He didn't want to end up like his tortured pal Galileo. So Descartes could do anything he wanted with bodies now, but he had to keep it separate from anything to do with the soul, and therefore with the mind. And Western science as we know it today plotted its present course. By the way, this led to another very common misconception. Since mind is now different than body, mental and emotional illnesses now became less serious and less real than physical illnesses. After Descartes, it was accepted that people with mental illnesses and behavioral issues, behavioral disorders, they suffered what they called weaknesses of the spirit and flaws of character rather than real diseases. So we just haul them off to the loony bin and warehouse them. Sadly, some of that impression still lingers on today. But there's good news. It's changing. So Descartes became the standard bearer for the concept that mind is separate from body and that God, and only God, is the mediator between the two. By the way, here's another famous quote from Descartes. Let's bring up another slide. Descartes said, "Each problem that I solved became the rule which served afterwards to solve other problems." So you can see that future science was built on a foundation that Descartes established. And so you think, well, wait a minute, if the foundation is flawed, well, we'll leave that up to you. Let's come back here. In the course of all of his workings and dealings, Descartes championed a methodology. All this stuff sort of compelled him to champion the methodology or the philosophy called reductionism. Reductionism is basically the belief that to solve problems here in the big world, you solve it under the microscope, and then you just increase the magnitude. You solve the problem in the model, and then roll it out to the real world. In other words, you solve by separating, by pulling a little out from the whole, by making something different than the rest, and then putting it back in and seeing what happens. Well, you and I can think of reductionism as the opposite of holism. Holism as in the context of holistic healing. All right, we're moving ahead with history here. When Descartes died in 1650, there was a young fellow named Isaac Newton who was about 7 years old. Isaac Newton did great things, but the model upon which he would operate was already set in stone. Now let's move forward about 200 years to the early 1800s. By this point, science and the church had both matured a lot, and the church, in fact, was a little less powerful than it used to be. It wasn't so dark ages anymore either. Still, the church, and most everyone else for that matter, scientists, believed that there was something unduplicable about living things. Something about living things that could not be reproduced in a laboratory from unliving things. It was believed, still at this time, that God, and only God, imbued a living thing with this stuff, whatever that stuff was that makes it alive, in some inexplicable way that only God could know. And hence we coined the term organic chemistry to study the chemistry of living organisms. But in 1828, there was this scientist named Friedrich Wöhler, and he synthesized the very first organic substance from inorganic products. He prepared something called urea by reacting lead cyanate with ammonia. And our concept of reality was rocked again. And accepted foundational separation was proven not to exist. Urea, by the way, is a primary ingredient in urine. And there's a legend, completely unproven, that when Wöhler first synthesized this product, he thought that he had synthesized dog urine. Another great moment in the history of science. All right, we're moving forward with history. We got more history than we have time to discuss it. We're moving forward to Einstein's time, about 75 years in the future. Einstein's great discoveries were in the early 20th century. Einstein did not throw out the reductionist model, but he was perhaps the first to really start poking holes in it. His Nobel Prize in 1921, by the way, was not for his theory of relativity. It was for something else, something called the photoelectric effect. Because science figured that whole relativity thing was so wacky and far out that they were going to disprove it all any day now. Right. Einstein was doing great work, but it was all going on concurrently with work of great medical scientists like Pasteur and Salk. And they were making their great discoveries using the old model. So the old model was working. This is why to this day, if you have a medical problem, you'll go in and you'll be tested by Einstein's science. You'll be tested by MRI machines and things like that. But you will be diagnosed and treated using Descartes' old model. All right, also going on at this time was the new science of neuropharmacology, the science of how drugs, you notice the word pharmacy in there, how drugs work on the brain and the nervous system. And they started realizing back in the early 1900s that they were making drugs that fixed some things and they didn't know why. So they began to envision a new model, postulating about things called ligands and receptors, just a very few of them, and they didn't get very far with it. And it was all imagination, at least until the early 70s, when the first receptors were actually isolated. And that's when we realized that it was all frogs and lily pads. So again, we see that while the old model was useful, another chink was in the armor, another hole in it. It was losing relevance. But politics and marketing are very vested in perpetuating the old model, because that's where the money is. So, even so, we've seen a holistic revolution. Well, what's up with that? In spite of what you might even call active suppression by the medical establishment. It's the reason that people seek out perhaps practitioners like myself, even though insurance won't pay for it and the doctor won't recommend it. It's why major drugstore chains are starting to put herbal medications out, even though the doctors won't recommend it. And so there is a grassroots awareness that the model is changing. Next show, we're going to learn a little bit more about history and a little bit more about the way this model changes. Because even though the alternative world is prohibited by law from making claims, it's here. So hang on to that. For now, we're out of time for the day. So get out your pencil. I wish you peace and positive energy and a healthy life in Energy Contact.
I'm gonna